He looked at his newborn son and said, "I don't want this life," then walked out without looking back. Like cold air on a winter morning, she reached for the plastic cup on the tray beside her, took a small sip of water, then set it back down with deliberate precision, her eyes drifting once more to the door, not expecting him to return, not hoping for it, just acknowledging the space he had left behind. Somewhere down the hall, a nurse laughed softly, a normal sound, a reminder that the world outside this room hadn't paused, and Emily let that sound pass through her without reacting, her gaze steady, her breathing even, because what had just happened wasn't chaos, it wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, controlled, and that was what made it final. She looked back at her son, really looked this time, memorizing the small details, the way his hand curled slightly against the blanket, the faint rise and fall of his chest, and for a moment something shifted, not emotion, not yet, just recognition, as if she had reached a point where everything unnecessary had fallen away and only the truth remained. Daniel thought he had walked away from a problem, something temporary, something he could close and move past, but Emily understood something he didn't, something he hadn't even considered, and she didn't say it out loud, didn't whisper it, didn't move at all. She just sat there in the quiet room, calm, composed, and let the realization settle into place, because what had just happened wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning, and he didn't know that yet. The nurse came in 15 minutes later and paused just inside the doorway, her hand still resting on the handle as if she could feel the shift in the room before she saw it, her eyes moving from Emily to the bassinet and then back again, measuring something quietly, professionally, before stepping fully inside and closing the door with a soft, careful click. She asked if everything was all right, her voice low, neutral, trained not to assume, and Emily nodded once without looking at her, the motion small but certain, as if the answer had already been decided and did not require discussion. The nurse adjusted the blanket around the baby, checked the monitors, made a note on the chart, all the small routine actions that filled space without changing anything, and then she hesitated for just a second, long enough to notice the absence, the missing second set of belongings, the untouched chair near the window, the silence where another voice should have been, but she did not ask. She simply said that discharge paperwork would be ready soon and that someone would come by later to go over instructions. Then she left the room as quietly as she had entered. Emily watched the door close again and let her deliberate, no hesitation, no correction, just a clean, controlled motion from start to finish. When she was done, she set the pen back exactly where it had been, straightened the stack of papers, and slid them to the edge of the tray as if completing a simple task, something administrative, something already decided long before this moment arrived. She leaned back slightly against the pillow, her eyes closing for a brief second, not in exhaustion, not in relief, but in quiet acknowledgement, and when she opened them again, the room looked the same light, the same walls, the same quiet, but something underneath it had shifted, something final. Daniel believed this paper ended things, that it simplified the situation, that it gave him control over what happened next, and Emily understood why he thought that. She understood exactly how he saw it, and that was why she did not argue, did not question, did not ask for anything more. She turned her head once more toward her son, watching him settle back into stillness, and her hand moved to rest lightly on the edge of the bassinet, her fingers barely touching it, grounding herself in something real, something that had not been negotiated or signed away. She sat there like that for a long moment, quiet, composed, letting the shape of the decision settle fully into place, because what Daniel had done was not just leave. He had shown her exactly how he thought, exactly what he valued, and exactly what he underestimated, and that clarity was more valuable than anything written on the pages she had just signed, because he did not know her the way he believed he did, and he had just made his first real mistake. The discharge happened the next morning without ceremony, a clipboard, a few quiet instructions, and a nurse who avoided asking questions she already understood the answers to, and Emily listened carefully, nodding at the right moments, repeating key details back in a steady voice, every step measured, every movement deliberate, as if she were following a plan that had already been decided long before anyone handed her the paperwork. The hallway outside the room felt colder than it had the day before. The overhead lights too bright, the air carrying that same sterile scent that clung to everything, and Emily moved slowly but without hesitation, one hand guiding the small hospital bassinet on wheels while the other held her son securely, wrapped in a thin blanket that seemed too light for the weight of what she was carrying. No one stopped her, no one questioned her, because nothing about her behavior suggested anything unusual. She looked like any other new mother leaving the hospital, calm, seat without hesitation, pulling the door closed with a soft, final sound that seemed louder than it should have been. The car pulled away from the hospital slowly, merging into the midday traffic, the building shrinking behind them in the rearview mirror, and Emily did not turn to look back. She kept her gaze forward, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her posture relaxed but intentional. The woman driving glanced at her briefly, then back to the road, her voice low when she finally spoke, asking only one question, "Are you ready?" And Emily answered without pause, her tone even, controlled, "I am." And nothing more needed to be said. The road stretched ahead in long, quiet lines, the rhythm of passing streetlights marking time in steady intervals, and Emily reached back once to check on her son, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the car seat, confirming he was there, safe, real, and then she returned her hand to her lap, her gaze fixed forward again. Daniel believed she would go home, that she would settle into the space he had left behind, that she would adjust to the version of reality he had created for her. But Emily had already stepped outside of that expectation, already moved beyond the path he assumed she would take, and the distance between what he believed and what was actually happening was growing with every mile they drove, though he did not know it yet, and that distance was exactly where everything would begin to change. They drove for just over 40 minutes before the car turned off the main road and onto a quieter residential street lined with older brick houses and tall trees that cast long shadows across the pavement, the kind of neighborhood where everything felt settled, deliberate, and unchanged by whatever noise existed outside of it. And Emily watched the shift in surroundings without asking where they were going, her eyes moving slowly from one house to the next as if memorizing the details, the spacing between driveways, the way the light hit the windows, the absence of movement on the sidewalks. The car slowed in front of a modest single-story home with a wide porch and white trim that had been repainted recently. The kind of place that did not draw attention but held its ground quietly, and the engine idled for a moment before the woman beside her turned it off completely, the sudden silence inside the car settling around them like a pause that had been expected. Neither of them spoke right away, and Emily did not rush to open the door. She simply sat there with her hands resting lightly in her lap, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, as if she were marking the transition from one phase to another, making sure nothing from the last place followed her here. The woman finally stepped out first, moving around the car with the same measured pace she had shown before, opening the back door and carefully lifting the car seat, checking the straps without being asked, adjusting the blanket just slightly before closing the door again with a soft, controlled motion. Emily stepped out next, the air here warmer than the hospital parking lot, carrying a faint scent of grass and something recently cut, and she stood for a second beside the car, her gaze taking in the house in front of her, not with curiosity, not with hesitation, but with quiet evaluation, as if she were confirming something she already knew. They walked up the short path together, the sound of their steps muted against the concrete, and when the door opened it did so before they reached it fully, as if someone inside had been waiting, watching for their arrival. And a younger woman stepped back to let them in. Her expression composed but alert, her eyes moving quickly from Emily to the baby and then to the older woman, exchanging a brief look that carried more information than words. The inside of the house was clean, organized, and intentionally simple, soft lighting, neutral colors, everything placed with purpose, nothing excessive, and Emily stepped inside without pause, her shoes making almost no sound against the floor as the door closed behind her, sealing the quiet space from the outside world. The baby was placed gently in a prepared crib in the corner of the living room, already set with fresh sheets and a small folded blanket, and Emily moved closer, resting her hand lightly on the edge, her fingers tracing the surface for just a second before pulling back, not out of uncertainty but out of control, maintaining distance where she chose it. The younger woman spoke briefly about supplies, about what had been arranged, her voice calm and efficient, listing details that suggested preparation had been in motion long before today, and Emily listened without interrupting, her gaze steady, absorbing everything, while the older woman moved quietly through the room, setting down bags, adjusting small things that did not need adjusting, maintaining motion without drawing attention. Emily finally walked to the window, her posture straight, her reflection faintly visible in the glass as she looked out at the quiet street, the stillness outside mirroring the calm inside her. And for a moment she said nothing, did nothing, simply stood there as if aligning herself with this new space. Daniel believed she would return to the house they had shared, that she would remain within the boundaries he had defined, that she would adjust to the absence he created. But Emily had already stepped into a different structure entirely, one he had never considered, one that did not include him, and as she turned away from the window and looked back at the room, at the people moving quietly within it, at the child resting where everything had already been prepared, it became clear that this was not a reaction, it was a continuation, something already in motion, something he had not seen. And that was the part he would not understand until it was far too late. The first night passed without announcement, no formal discussion, no visible adjustment, just a quiet transition from one reality into another, and Emily moved through the house with the same measured control she had carried since the hospital, her steps soft, her attention precise, as if every small action mattered more than anything she might say. The baby woke twice, small restless sounds that filled the otherwise still rooms, and each time Emily was already awake before the sound fully formed, her body responding before thought, lifting him carefully, adjusting the blanket, holding him close just long enough to settle him. Without lingering, her movements efficient, practiced in a way that suggested she had already accepted this rhythm. The older woman remained in the background, never interfering, only stepping in when necessary, warming a bottle, placing a folded towel within reach, adjusting the dim light near the crib so it did not fall too harshly across the room, and the younger woman checked in briefly before retreating again, her presence quiet but intentional, like someone following instructions that had been set long before Emily arrived. No one asked questions and Emily did not offer explanations, the silence between them not uncomfortable but structured, as if each of them understood their role without needing to define it. Sometime after midnight, Emily stood alone in the kitchen, a glass of water in her hand, the faint glow from the overhead light reflecting off the counter, and she remained still for several seconds, not out of uncertainty but out of calculation, her gaze fixed on nothing in particular as her thoughts moved in a direction that was not visible on her face. She set the glass down gently, aligning it with the edge of the counter, and reached for her phone, the screen lighting up her features in a soft, cool tone, and for a moment she simply held it, not rushing, not hesitating, just waiting until the timing felt exact. When she finally dialed, the call connected on the second ring, and she did not introduce herself, did not explain, she only said, "It has started." Her voice even, controlled, carrying no trace of the moment that had led here. There was a brief pause on the other end, then a quiet acknowledgement, nothing more, no questions, no surprise, just confirmation, and Emily ended the call without adding anything further, placing the phone back on the counter with the same precision she had shown in everything else. She returned to the living room, pausing beside the crib, her hand resting lightly against the edge again, not touching the baby this time, just grounding herself in the presence of something real, something unchanged by decisions or signatures. Outside, the street remained still, no passing cars, no distant noise, the kind of silence that made time feel slower than it was, and Emily stood there long enough for the quiet to settle fully around her, her posture straight, her expression calm, her breathing steady. Daniel believed the situation had resolved itself, that the documents had closed the matter, that Emily would adjust within the boundaries he had set, but he had not accounted for this part, the part that did not react, did not argue, did not resist, the part that moved quietly, precisely, and without warning. What he had seen as compliance was something else entirely, something controlled, something deliberate, and as Emily finally stepped back from the crib and turned off the light, leaving the room in a soft, dim glow, it became clear that nothing about this was accidental. Not the timing, not the silence, not the decision to leave without a trace, because this was not about escaping what had happened, it was about allowing it to unfold exactly as it needed to, and he did not know that yet. The next morning arrived without announcement, a pale line of light slipping through the curtains and stretching slowly across the floor, and Emily was already awake before the house fully stirred, sitting upright on the edge of the bed in the small guest room she had been given, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly against her knees, as if she had been there for some time, waiting for the day to begin rather than reacting to it. She stood after a moment and moved quietly through the hallway, her steps measured, her attention fixed not on where she was going but on how she moved, every action controlled, deliberate, leaving no room for hesitation. The living room was still dim, the soft outline of the crib visible in the corner, and she approached it without sound, pausing just beside it, her gaze lowering to where her son lay sleeping, his breathing even, his small chest rising and falling in a rhythm untouched by anything that had happened, and Emily watched him for a few Seconds, not with uncertainty, not with overwhelm, but with quiet acknowledgement, as if confirming once again what mattered and what did not. She adjusted the edge of the blanket by less than an inch, then stepped back, maintaining that same precise distance she had kept since arriving, not withdrawing, not overreaching, just holding the line exactly where she intended it to be. In the kitchen, the older woman was already preparing coffee, the faint smell filling the space, and she glanced up briefly when Emily entered, offering a small nod that was returned in the same manner. No words exchanged, no need for them, and the younger woman joined them a few minutes later, placing a folder on the table without comment, sliding it across just enough for Emily to reach it easily. Emily sat down, her movements slow and intentional, and opened the folder without asking what it contained, her eyes scanning the pages with the same calm focus she had shown the day before, absorbing names, dates, structured details, her expression unchanged as she turned each page, taking in everything without pause. There were timelines, financial records, ownership structures, pieces of information arranged in a way that suggested they had been collected carefully over time, not rushed, not improvised, and Emily did not react to any of it outwardly. She simply continued reading until she reached the last page, then closed the folder gently and placed her hand flat on top of it for a brief second, grounding the moment. The younger woman spoke then, her voice low, outlining next steps, schedules, what would happen and when, and Emily listened without interrupting, her gaze steady, her breathing even, as if the conversation was confirming something she had already decided rather than presenting new information. When the explanation finished, Emily nodded once, a small, controlled motion, and said only, "Proceed." Her tone quiet but final, leaving no space for interpretation. Outside, the street remained calm, sunlight now fully settled across the pavement, and inside the house everything moved forward in the same quiet rhythm. No urgency, no raised voices, only a steady progression of actions aligned towards something that had already begun. Daniel believed time was on his side, that distance would simplify things, that silence meant resolution, but he did not understand this kind of silence. The kind that was structured, intentional, and already connected to a sequence he could not see. And as Emily stood from the table, leaving the folder exactly where it was placed, and walked back toward the living room without looking back, it became clear that what had started in that hospital room was no longer contained to a single decision. It had expanded into something far more controlled, far more precise, and he was already part of it whether he realized it or not. 3 days later, the house had settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary, and that was what made it effective. Nothing rushed, nothing out of place, just a sequence of small, controlled actions repeating with quiet precision, and Emily moved through each one without deviation, her presence steady, her expression unchanged, as if she had always belonged inside this structure. The baby's schedule had already aligned with the environment, feeding, resting, small movements that filled the space without disrupting it, and Emily responded to each need without hesitation, not reacting, not overcorrecting, just maintaining balance, as though she were calibrating something invisible with every motion. The older woman remained consistent in the background, adjusting details before they became issues, refilling supplies, organizing small items that did not need to be reorganized, her actions subtle but intentional, while the younger woman appeared at specific intervals, never early, never late, always with something concrete, a document, a call, an update delivered in a low voice that did not linger. That afternoon, the same folder returned to the table, but this time it was thicker, expanded, and Emily opened it without pause, her eyes scanning line after line, absorbing new layers of information, financial trails, corporate ties, timestamps, patterns that only revealed themselves when viewed without emotion. And she did not react outwardly, but her focus sharpened, her posture tightening by just enough to signal recognition. Daniel's name appeared in structured contexts, not as a person but as a variable, part of a system of decisions, transactions, movements that extended further than what he had shown at the hospital, and Emily turned each page with the same steady pace, her breathing even, her attention complete, as if she were mapping something that had already been outlined in her mind. The younger woman spoke again, outlining connections, explaining what had already been confirmed, what was still being tracked, and what would surface next if nothing was interrupted, and Emily listened without interrupting, her gaze never leaving the page until she reached the end, at which point she closed the folder slowly and rested her hand against it once more. Outside, a car passed by, the sound brief and distant, fading quickly back into silence, and inside the room the stillness held, not empty but controlled, like a space designed to absorb information without distortion. Emily stood after a moment, walking to the window again, her reflection faint against the glass, and she looked out not at the street but at the space beyond it, as if measuring distance in a way that did not rely on sight. Daniel believed he had reduced everything to a manageable outcome, that by stepping away early he had avoided complication, but what he had actually done was expose a pattern, one that extended beyond a single decision, one that could now be followed, understood, and eventually used. Emily turned back toward the table, her expression unchanged, and spoke only once, her voice calm, precise. "Do not interrupt the sequence." And the younger woman nodded immediately, understanding without needing clarification, because interruption would change the timing, and timing was now the only variable that mattered. The baby stirred softly in the crib, a small sound that cut briefly through the quiet, and Emily crossed the room without haste, adjusting the blanket again by the smallest degree, her movements exact, controlled, and then she stepped back, returning to the same position she had held before. Nothing about this was reactive anymore. Nothing was uncertain. Everything was moving forward exactly as it needed to, and Daniel, wherever he was, still believed the situation had ended, still believed silence meant resolution. But the truth was simpler and far more precise than that. The silence was not the absence of action, it was the structure that allowed everything else to unfold, and he had not seen it coming. Weeks passed without disruption, and that was the point. Nothing escalated too quickly, nothing revealed itself prematurely. The structure held steady, quiet on the surface while something far more precise continued beneath it, and Emily remained exactly where she needed to be within that structure, never ahead of it, never behind, always aligned with its timing. The house maintained its calm rhythm, mornings beginning with soft light filtering through the curtains, afternoons settling into stillness broken only by small necessary movements, evenings closing gently without ceremony. And within that rhythm Emily operated with the same control she had shown from the beginning, her actions consistent, her presence stable, her silence unchanged. The folder returned again, this time not placed on the table but handed directly to her by the younger woman, who stood a step closer than usual, her posture more alert, her tone quieter when she spoke, indicating that something had shifted. Not outwardly, but within the sequence itself. Emily took the folder without comment, opening it immediately, her eyes scanning faster than before, not rushed but more focused, as if she already knew what she was looking for and was confirming it rather than discovering it. New documents had been added, records of communications, scheduled appearances, public statements that had begun to surface in controlled environments, and Emily paused for the first time in several days, her gaze resting on a single page longer than necessary, not because it was unclear, but because it was expected. Daniel had started speaking publicly, carefully, strategically, not about details, not about specifics, but about absence, about regret, about rebuilding, the language structured to create a narrative that could be accepted without being questioned, and Emily read each line without expression, absorbing not just the words but the timing of them, the placement, the audience they were directed toward. The younger woman spoke softly, outlining how the messaging was being received, how it was spreading, how it would continue if left uninterrupted, and Emily listened without interrupting, her posture unchanged, her breathing even, her attention fixed entirely on the pattern forming in front of her. Outside, the light shifted slowly across the room, marking time in quiet increments, and inside nothing moved faster than it needed to, the older woman passing briefly through the space, adjusting a small detail near the crib, then disappearing again without drawing focus. Emily closed the folder after a long moment, placing it down with the same precision she had used every time before, her hand resting against it just long enough to confirm the decision forming beneath the surface, and then she stood, walking toward the window once more, her reflection faint in the glass, her gaze steady as she looked out at the unchanged street. Daniel believed he was regaining control of the narrative, that by stepping forward publicly he could reshape what had already happened, that distance and time would soften the edges of his decision. But what he did not understand was that every word he released, every appearance he made, was not resetting anything, it was defining it, locking it into place in a way that could not be undone. Emily turned slightly, her eyes moving from the window back to the room, to the folder, to the quiet presence of the people who had not asked questions because they already understood the answer. And she spoke once, her voice calm, precise, "Let him continue." And the younger woman nodded immediately because interruption would break the pattern before it fully revealed itself. The baby stirred softly, a small movement that pulled Emily's attention for a brief second, and she crossed the room without hesitation, adjusting the blanket again with that same exact motion, her control never slipping, never rushing, always measured. Nothing about this moment required urgency. Nothing needed to be forced because the sequence had reached a point where it would move forward on its own, guided not by reaction but by inevitability. And as Emily stepped back from the crib and allowed the quiet to settle once more, it became clear that the stage Daniel believed he was stepping onto was not one he controlled. It was one that had been prepared long before he realized he was part of it, and he was already moving exactly where he needed to be. The invitation arrived without urgency, a single envelope placed on the table beside the folder as if it had always been part of the sequence, cream-colored, unmarked except for a name printed in clean, deliberate lettering, and Emily noticed it the moment she entered the room, her gaze shifting to it briefly before settling back into its usual calm. The younger woman did not point it out, did not explain. She simply stood nearby, waiting in that same controlled silence that had defined everything since the beginning, and after a few seconds Emily stepped forward, picked up the envelope and opened it with steady hands, the paper inside unfolding without resistance. It was an announcement, a public event scheduled in a large downtown venue, a charity function positioned as a moment of reflection, of accountability, of forward movement, and Daniel's name appeared at the center of it, framed carefully within language that suggested sincerity, regret, and the desire to make things right. And Emily read every line without expression, her eyes moving slowly across the page, absorbing not just the words but the intention behind them. He was not hiding anymore. He was stepping forward, placing himself in front of an audience, inviting attention, inviting judgment, and most importantly, inviting a response, and Emily understood exactly what that meant. She folded the paper once, aligning the edges precisely, then set it back on the table beside the folder, her hand resting lightly on both for a brief second, grounding the moment before releasing it. The older woman moved quietly in the background, adjusting nothing in particular, maintaining the same steady presence, while the younger woman finally spoke, her voice low, outlining the structure of the event, the timing, the expected attendance, the way the narrative would be presented if left uninterrupted. And Emily listened without interrupting, her posture unchanged, her attention complete. Outside, the afternoon light stretched longer across the street, shadows forming slowly against the pavement, and inside the room the air remained still, controlled, as if everything had narrowed to this single point in time. Daniel believed this moment would restore balance, that standing in front of others and acknowledging what he framed as a mistake would allow him to reshape the outcome, but he did not understand that by stepping into a public space, he had shifted the terms entirely from something private and controlled to something visible and fixed. Emily picked up the envelope again, sliding the invitation back inside with the same precision she had used to remove it, then turned toward the window, her reflection faint but steady, her gaze focused beyond the glass, beyond the quiet street, as if aligning herself with something already in motion. She did not need to ask if she would attend, she did not need to confirm what would happen next, because the sequence had already reached its natural conclusion, and this was the final stage of it. She spoke once, her voice calm, measured, "We will be there." And the younger woman nodded immediately, understanding that this was not a decision being made in that moment, it was a continuation of everything that had led to it. The baby stirred softly behind her, a small movement that drew her attention for just a second, and she turned, adjusting the blanket with that same exact motion. Her control never breaking, her focus never shifting away from what mattered. The room settled back into silence, but it was no longer the kind of silence that concealed. It was the kind that held everything in place, waiting for the exact moment to release it. Daniel had stepped onto the stage believing he would control what happened there, believing he would define the narrative in front of an audience that only knew what he chose to show them. But Emily understood something he did not, something he had never accounted for, that the stage he was preparing to stand on was not empty. It had been built with intention, with timing, with precision, and by the time the lights turned on and the room filled with people ready to listen, everything would already be in position, and all that would remain was the moment he realized it.